All right, my screen share is not wanting to cooperate. Let's try this. There we go. So I am grateful for this opportunity to share this time with you as together we continue our exploration of racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Today, we are focusing on part 3 of 6, 20th century public policy and the civil rights movement. This marks a period when racism in society and public policy intensified beyond the South, in part because of population shifts, such as the Great Migration, and the continuing outsized influence of Southern politicians on federal policy. All of this was undergirded by our country's perpetuation of the myth of racial inferiority and the strengthening influence of white supremacy. Other countries with similarly sordid pasts have sought to move forward via a process called truth and reconciliation. America is in desperate need of such a process. So we here for these 6 weeks are embarking on a search for more truth. Much of it is painful, as we have already seen, incomprehensible even, especially for those of us who believe that we are good people who seek justice and peace for everyone. Much of this history isn't just history, but is alive and pervasive in our society today. I believe that in bringing to light this history of ours that we should have known but didn't, and seeing its impact on our country even today, we may develop a new or renewed urgency to act, to finally and truly address these profound inequities. So let's continue. A brief recap of our time together last week. We saw the unchecked power of white supremacy, especially in the South, where loss in the war intensified the anger and the desire for dominance of white people over those formerly enslaved. Even the presence of federal troops during the short period of Reconstruction couldn't stop it. The insidious application of the 13th Amendment, particularly its loophole that prohibited slavery except in the case of conviction of a crime, led to the passage of laws known as Black Codes, laws targeted specifically at Black people that led to arrest, conviction, incarceration, and the system of convict leasing for the benefit of the states, and ultimately the use of public chain gangs. We saw how the Supreme Court decision in 1896, in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, made separate but equal the law of the land that led to 70 years of Jim Crow laws and punitive segregation. All of these Jim Crow laws affected every aspect of social interactions, keeping Black and white people separate, with an inability to get to know one another as individual human beings. All of this reinforced by terror spectacle lynchings that demonstrated the complicity of entire communities, particularly aimed at disenfranchising Black people and preventing them from being able to exercise their right to vote. And we see that action being replicated today with less overt violence, but the goal is the same. Ultimately, conditions in the South and opportunities in the North and West led to the Great Migration, where more than 6 million African Americans left the South with huge demographic impacts across the country. I'm going to share with you kind of an overview of a timeline and a capturing of this sense of white supremacy in the context of a subject that was all in the news a number of years ago, and it had to do with Confederate monuments.
Mhm.
And so if we look at this timeline, I know it's tiny, a lot of detail, but it begins in 1861, around the start of the Civil War. And we see that that year there were 4 Confederate monuments erected in the United States, in the South. And the end of this timeline is 2016. And if you see the progression, you will see that after the war, there were a number of additional Confederate monuments that were erected. But then the start of that huge increase was the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision and the basically total segregation, at least in the South. In 1909, the NAACP was formed, and in 1915, as that bar starts to rise significantly, the Ku Klux Klan introduced its second founding. And the remainder of that huge peak took place during the beginning of the Great Migration and continued in 1920-21 with the Tulsa, it says race riots, but we know it was not a riot by Black people. And then there was a steady increase in Confederate monuments that dropped off around the time of World War II. The country's attention turned to other issues. But we saw another peaking of Confederate monument construction during the period of the 1950s and 1960s, which we will come to see as the major efforts of the civil rights movement. It's interesting to me that Confederate monuments were placed in Utah, in New Mexico, in California. I don't think they were honoring local heroes when those monuments were put in place. But just an overview of this time period and yet another representation of the tension and the angst and the anxiety that was fought in the Civil War. So we turn our attention this evening to the middle of the 20th century and national public policy. We're moving beyond just actions being taken in the South to national public policy in the areas of housing, Social Security, the GI Bill, education, and even the interstate highway system. And these public policies further cemented racial discrimination. And then we will look at the pivotal events and the impact of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. So we begin by looking at the subject of housing segregation. As Black people began to move out of the South into the North and West, those cities, in addition to Southern cities, mandated the areas where Black people could live. If you are a Black person, you can live here, you cannot live here. But there was a Supreme Court case in 1917, Buchanan v. Worley, that challenged the ability of cities to tell Black people where they could live. And indeed, the Supreme Court said that that was unconstitutional. But the reason it was unconstitutional was that it was government mandated segregation. And so the reaction to the inability of cities to make that determination, the real estate market, the cities, the states transitioned to what were known as racially restricted deed covenants. These were clauses written into property deeds that said that you could only sell this property to a person of the same race. And so by 1940, with the usage of those restrictive covenants, 80% of the residential properties in Chicago and LA, and 85% of those properties in Detroit carried these racially restricted deed covenants. And I have taught this class series in the past where people went home and looked at their property deeds. And a not insignificant number of people have found a racially restricted deed covenant in the deed to their home. Didn't even know it was there, certainly didn't see it being enforced, but the legacy of those covenants still exists. So once again, this idea of ensuring that you could only sell your property to another white person was challenged in court. And in 1948, the Supreme Court said the covenants are not illegal, enforcement is. So as long as you're doing this because you want to, it's fine. And so the usage of those covenants continued and spread until they were finally outlawed by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So for more than 50 years, this kind of restriction on who could buy property during the biggest expansion of homeownership in our country's history, these covenants kept most Black people locked out of the housing market. Along the way, in 1934, Congress created the Federal Housing Administration. It was created by the National Housing Act that was passed because the housing market in the United States was in chaos following the market crash and the Great Depression. At that time, mortgages typically required a huge down payment and that the balance of the mortgage be paid off in a 10-year period. And the economic consequences of the Great Depression meant that more than 50% of mortgages in the entire country were in default. And so no new houses were being built. The housing market was collapsing. So in passing the National Housing Act of 1934, Congress created the FHA, which did not issue mortgages, but it insured mortgages that might be issued by banks. And these FHA mortgages only required a 5% down payment and allowed for a 30-year repayment period. And it revitalized the housing market, which was its intention. But in the process, the Home Ownership Loan Corporation created what were called residential security maps for 239 cities across the country. And this introduced a concept that came to be known as redlining, which is a practice of denying or limiting financial services to certain neighborhoods based on their racial or ethnic composition without regard to the residents' qualifications or creditworthiness. And these maps were used by the FHA. Here's an example. This is the HOLC, the residential security map for the city of Atlanta in 1935. And it would be accompanied by a legend that would describe the colors. Green was labeled best place to make a mortgage, to lend money. Blue was labeled still desirable. Yellow was identified as definitely declining, and red was labeled hazardous, as in don't issue mortgages here. And the descriptions of the populations in these areas, particularly in the yellow and the red areas, included words like subversive, undesirable, inharmonious, lower grade populations. And interestingly, there is a website today called Mapping Inequality that has taken 150 of these residential security maps and has overlaid them with maps today. And it shows that the poverty levels in these cities map almost identically to these residential security maps. So back in the day, the ethnic groups labeled as subversive or undesirable, the areas where mortgages were not encouraged are today the places where poverty is the most prevalent. So how was that done? Well, if you applied for an FHA mortgage, an adjuster went out and looked at the house and looked at the community. And they had an underwriter's manual that they used. And some of the terms in the underwriter's manual, said things like deed restrictions are apt to prove more effective than a zoning ordinance in providing protection from adverse influences, where the same deed restrictions apply over a broad area, and where these restrictions relate to types of structures, use to which improvements may be put, and racial occupancy, a favorable condition is apt to exist. The geographical position of a location may afford, in certain instances, reliable protection against adverse influences. The valuator should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. Recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances, and to be really effective should include the provisions listed below, which included prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they were intended. Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. So these were the conditions considered in deciding whether or not to grant an FHA mortgage. In the late 1930s, as Detroit grew outward, white families began to settle near a Black enclave adjacent to 8 Mile Road. By 1940, the Blacks were surrounded, but neither they nor the whites could get FHA insurance because of the proximity of an inharmonious racial group. So in 1941, an enterprising white developer built a concrete wall between the white and Black areas. The FHA appraisers then took another look and approved the mortgages on the white properties. Sadly, not only did these conditions and these circumstances and these assessments continue to be utilized for FHA mortgages, but once the GI Bill was passed, these same considerations were utilized by the Veterans Administration in looking at mortgage applications from veterans. And indeed, the same terms and conditions were used by private realtors. So if you are a Black person or a Black couple, you are financially well enough, well enough off to purchase a home, but you can't get one of these mortgages, what do? Well, a capitalist system solution sprang up, known as contracts for deed. These were arrangements usually offered by speculators who bought up properties specifically for this purpose. It required a down payment and regular monthly installments from the occupant, but that's where the similarity to a mortgage ended. The sale price and effective interest rates tended to be wildly inflated because these were being offered to Black people where this was their only option to, in some sense, acquire a property on a mortgage. The buyer assumed all the responsibilities of a homeowner, including repairs and taxes, but the seller retained the title along with the power to evict for even a single missing payment. And indeed, often at the end of the contract, if it had been satisfactorily completed, the prospective buyer was presented with an insurance bill that was sometimes thousands of dollars that had to be paid in a very short period of time, or the contract was null and void and the property reverted to the speculator. So these families who bought on contract didn't accumulate equity. They couldn't borrow against their equity to make home improvements, to send their children to college. And so it was a long and precarious path to home ownership. And indeed, one of the ways that these properties became eligible for a contract for deed is these speculators would hire Black women to go into the yellow or even the green areas on the residential security map, pushing a baby carriage. And then a representative of the speculator would knock on doors in the neighborhood and say, you know, they're coming, and you don't want to be the last to sell your house when they're here. And so it perpetuated this horrific residential discrimination. All of this not outlawed until the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So for the 35 years, that was the greatest home building boom in the history of our country. Black prospective homeowners were basically locked out of the market. Between 1935 and 1962, the FHA and the VA, the Veterans Administration, issued $120 billion in mortgages, and more than 98% of those mortgages went to white people. And so this housing policy intensified housing segregation, which led, of course, to educational segregation. And the impact on the quality of education was impacted by the fact that many school districts raised their funds based on property taxes. And as those left behind in the crumbling buildings and cities, the property tax value, the property values went down, the taxes went down. And so educational inequality became more severe, which of course impacted economic employment opportunity and the ongoing economic impact on Black families. In addition, as families were crowded into smaller and smaller areas with less and less funds to invest in the communities, there were environmental and health impacts as well. And all of this led to a wealth ratio where today the average Black family's wealth, net worth, is 5% of that of the average white family. And the income ratio is 60% Black to white. Indeed, in the period between 1984 and 2009, the racial wealth gap tripled. And today, 42% of Black households are homeowners, while 73% of white households are homeowners. The impact is everywhere. We look at other public programs implemented in this time period. First was the Social Security Act of 1935. Title II is the most familiar, the Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance. I really don't like that term, old age. I just don't like it. But anyway, it turns out that which we tend to think of as Social Security, domestic and farm workers were excluded when the Social Security program was written. And at that point in time, 65% of African Americans worked in those two categories of employment. Remember, after Reconstruction, when the Black codes were written, often the only jobs that Black people were allowed to hold were that of domestic and farm workers. You know, there was an interesting study done a number of years ago when someone had said, you know, that's a pretty racist condition of the Social Security system. And a cadre of academics did a study and they said, no, it wasn't racist at all. It was purely logistical and economic, because looking at it, it was going to be really hard to collect Social Security taxes from farms and from domestic workers and domestic employers. So it would be too hard to collect the taxes. So we'll just keep those people out of the system. Of course, somehow farmers and domestic workers still end up paying income taxes. The government can find them for that purpose, but they were excluded. Later on, there were some slight extensions of the program, but by then it had become a matter of practice that farmers and domestic workers did not participate in Social Security and were not building that support for their retirement. The other programs included in the Social Security Act of 1935 were funds provided for specific programs that were designed to be of aid to anybody, but they were implemented as block grants of money given to the states, and then it was left to the states to decide who would receive the funds from these programs. And we saw the same kinds of bias and discrimination taking place, particularly in the southern states, but not exclusively. Not too long afterwards, following World War II, the GI Bill was written as one of the most race-neutral benefit plans in the country's history. It offered mortgages and other loans to veterans, as well as education benefits. But part of the compromise necessary to pass the GI Bill in Congress was the insistence of the Southern representatives that these programs would not be implemented at the federal level, but by state agencies. And so in that implementation, there was discrimination in housing, as we just saw, in education. It actually intensified segregation and had huge economic consequences. In terms of education, the GI Bill offered a path toward vocational training or college or university education. Given the starting point for Black versus white veterans, there were more circumstances where Black veterans and their families had less financial wherewithal to say, I'm going to take time off and go to college or go to school. That being said, those who sought to pursue the education benefits of the GI Bill found significant discrimination in the two paths. In the first case, particularly for veterans in the South, not a single college or university in any of the southern states, other than the HBCUs, would admit a single Black student. And so the HBCUs didn't have the capacity to take all of the veterans who wanted a college education, and the white schools wouldn't take them. In the North, the colleges and universities had very, very low quota levels for the number of non-white students they would accept. And so the bulk of Black veterans were steered toward vocational schools, which might be okay, but in many instances, when they got to the schools, they found that the equipment and the materials that were being used to teach the trade were reserved for the use of white students. And the Black students were to learn by watching the white students gain the skills. At the same time, much of this and much of the protest against it was being affected by violence directed at Black veterans. A famous but very little known case is that of Isaac Woodard. On February 12th, 1946, Isaac Woodard, who was a 26-year-old Black Army veteran, boarded a bus in Augusta, Georgia. Earlier that day, he'd been honorably discharged following his service in World War II, and he was heading home to Winsboro, South Carolina, to reunite with his wife. Along the way, the bus driver made a stop, and Isaac asked if he could use a restroom. The driver swore at him, and as Isaac acknowledged, subsequently he swore back. Neither man said anything further until the bus stopped in Batesburg, South Carolina, where the bus driver found some police officers at the bus station and told them of Isaac's impudence. And so Woodard was ordered off the bus. When he tried to give his version of events, a police officer struck him with a nightstick, and he was escorted to the local jail, where he was repeatedly beaten by the police chief, Linwood Shull, who pounded him in his eyes with the end of his nightstick until he blacked out. Once Woodard regained consciousness, he couldn't see. He was charged with disorderly conduct, the police claiming he'd been intoxicated, even though everyone on the bus said that Isaac had had nothing to drink. He had to pay a fine. And then he was driven to a veterans hospital in Columbia, where doctors told him that he would be permanently blind. The NAACP tried to take on Woodard's case. There was a trial of Linwood Shull, and an all-white jury found him not guilty of any crime. But Isaac's case attracted the attention of Orson Welles, and even Woody Guthrie wrote a song about his case. And ultimately, President Harry Truman heard the story, and he tried to see that Linwood Shull might be persecuted because, on a federal level, because Isaac had been wearing his military uniform. But the all-white jury once again exonerated Shull. But this case stuck with Harry Truman in a way that none other had. He formed the first President's Committee on Civil Rights, and on July 26, 1948, because of his connection with Isaac Woodard, President Truman issued an executive order that desegregated the United States Armed Forces. We'll take a look at school desegregation during this period of time. We know that Plessy v. Ferguson declared separate but equal facilities to be constitutional, and nowhere did that have a more negative effect on the Black population than in the field of education. It was predicated on underlying assumptions of Black inferiority and inability. In Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, there were 5 million African Americans, and more than half of them had less than 5 years of education. So the Brown v. Board of Education case worked its way to the Supreme Court, and 1954, the opinion was issued. To get there, it's important to understand that the case was actually filed in 1952 when Fred Vinson was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But shortly thereafter, Chief Justice Vinson passed away, and President Eisenhower named former California Governor Earl Warren to be the new Chief Justice of the United States. Eisenhower saying later that it was the worst political decision of his entire career. The president hosted a dinner party in the White House to explain to Chief Justice Warren that Southerners, quote, are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside big, overgrown Negroes. That's all. In Delaware, Black students were barred from publicly aided schools as early as 1821. By 1950, the state of Delaware had one public high school, other than a small schoolhouse on the campus of Delaware State University. One public high school in Delaware that would admit Black students, and it was Howard High School in Wilmington, Delaware. So if you lived in the outer reaches of Newcastle County, you might have a really hard time getting to Howard. And if you lived in Cantor, Sussex County, you had to find family, friends, or relatives with whom you could live in Wilmington so that you could attend Howard. That was the state of education when Brown v. Board of Education was decided. And the resistance to that Supreme Court decision was massive. The District Court for Delaware authorized a 12-year delay because there was a subsequent decision that said Brown v. Board of Education should be implemented with all deliberate speed. And the Delaware court decided that a full 12-year education cycle was speedy enough for the implementation of Brown v. Board of Education. Prince Edward County closed all of its public schools from 1959 to 1964. Southern white segregationists sent funds to establish some white private schools in the area, but even that didn't aid all of the white students. Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina declared that the federal courts had no jurisdiction and they were not required to honor the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Georgia voted to repeal its ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and they voted to impeach the Supreme Court. And so what developed became known as the Southern Manifesto, which was to stall and defy. The Alabama Constitution to this day still mandates segregated schools across the state. There were a number of famous instances in the implementation of Brown v. Board of Education. The first was the Little Rock Nine, where 9 African-American students desegregated Central High School. This is a photograph of Elizabeth Eckford. You may have seen it. The 9 students and their parents had all decided that on the day that these students were going to first go to Central High School, they would meet together outside the area where the white mob had gathered so that they could all go in together. But Elizabeth Eckford's family didn't have a telephone and she didn't get the message. And she showed up at school all by herself. There's a book by one of the 9, Melba Patillo Beals, called Warriors Don't Cry, that describes the Little Rock Nine's experience throughout the school year. I think we all saw the beginning, the National Guard, outside the building. Finally, they were allowed in, but the story of that full school year is extraordinary, and the book well worth reading. 3 years later, in 1960, little Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old, became the only child to desegregate the William Frantz Elementary School. The NAACP in New Orleans had tested a number of young Black students to find those who were exceptionally capable, so that there would be no possibility of anyone saying they didn't have the capability to succeed in school. And the night before the 6 were to begin at the William Frantz Elementary School, the other 5 parents decided that they were not going to subject their children to this program. And so Ruby Bridges, by herself, desegregated that school that year. Every parent in the school said they would not allow their children to sit in a classroom with Ruby. Every white teacher in the school, save one, said they would not teach Ruby Bridges. The one exception was Barbara Henry, who was a transplant from Boston, and she said, "I will teach Ruby." And for that year, Barbara Henry and Ruby sat in a classroom. Ruby was escorted to and from school by federal marshals, armed federal marshals. The local grocery store banned her parents from shopping there. Her father was fired from his job, and her grandparents were evicted from their sharecropper farms because Ruby Bridges went to school. You may have heard it said, if Ruby Bridges was strong enough to live through this, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, then your 6-year-old is strong enough to read about it, to learn about it. Norman Rockwell wrote a famous painting that represented Ruby's experience. And there have been unseen consequences of this rebellion. If you look today at the states with the lowest level of education in our country, they include Texas, Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and West Virginia. Those states that fought so hard to prevent integration, desegregation, support to public schools today have the lowest level of educational attainment, regardless of race. We're going to turn our attention to, of all things, the interstate highway system, which was created by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 during Eisenhower's presidency. The initial construction displaced over 1 million people, the vast majority of whom were low-income people of color. Their property was seized by eminent domain. Communities were fractured. If you're familiar with Wilmington, Delaware, the Adams-Jackson Street corridor where the I-95 roadway runs through split that community irrevocably and has created so many of the economic and environmental injustices that have prevailed since then. And it happened all over the country. So that's the backdrop. There are some of the inequities, the things that were going on that were so palpably discriminatory and unfair. And so activists began to speak out in what became known as the Civil Rights Movement. And you may have seen some of these images. In reality, it was the presence of these images on people's television screens that triggered the Civil Rights Movement, because up until then, all of this discrimination was happening below the radar. Many, particularly white people, didn't even know that it was happening, but suddenly they turned on the news and they saw Black people protesting being able to vote, being attacked by police dogs and billy clubs. The center photo is Rosa Parks being fingerprinted when she was removed from the bus in Birmingham. You see Bull Connor's fire department, people attacking Black protesters with fire hoses. The lower center photo is the attack on the peaceful marchers attempting to cross the William Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. John Lewis among them, who ended up with a fractured skull. And so the influence of TV in the 1950s and 1960s is similar to the influence of cell phone videos that we are seeing in this day and age, where it brings to light the brutality and the discrimination that makes it impossible to pretend that it doesn't exist. And so what we saw during this period of 1950 to 1975, 150 new Confederate monuments were erected across the country. Law enforcement agencies were aligned with this brutality, and they indeed became the face of the violent resistance to integration and voting rights. Is there any problem understanding the difficult relationships between communities of color and police and governmental agencies? All of these actions shape today's relationships between police and communities of color. And so that was the backdrop in the early 1950s. But a triggering event involved a young 14-year-old boy from Chicago, Illinois. His mother thought it would do him good to visit his uncle and relatives in Money, Mississippi for the summer, get out of the hot city, play with his cousins, and enjoy the countryside. And so Emmett Till joined his cousins, and very early in his visit, he went to the Bryant General Store, where there are conflicting stories, but it is thought that he whistled at the white female owner of the store. People said that Emmett was a cheeky little boy. 14-year-olds can be that way. But Carolyn Bryant's husband and his half-brother were out of town when it happened. And when they returned, she told them that she had been insulted or assaulted or mistreated by this boy. And so Roy Bryant and his half-brother, J.W. Milan, went to Emmett's uncle's house and demanded that he be turned over to them. The uncle tried to resist. His aunt went to a neighboring white household and asked the residents there to intervene. The wife wanted to, but the husband refused to get involved. And so Roy and J.W. took Emmett off into the night. His body surfaced in the Tallahatchie River some days later. They clearly thought that they had taken pains to prevent that from happening so that he would simply have disappeared. A cotton gin fan blade was tied around his neck with barbed wire. And when the local authorities tried to quickly bury Emmett in Mississippi, but his mother demanded that he be returned to her in Chicago. And the NAACP and the federal government got involved, and Emmett's body was returned. And she insisted on an open casket, as she said, so the world could see what hate has done to my little boy. And the photograph was taken and published in Jet magazine. And it galvanized a commitment to action that had been bubbling up, but this was a significant triggering event, as was the Montgomery bus boycott that went on for a year before the bus company finally called Uncle and allowed Black riders to sit wherever they wanted on the Montgomery buses. In 1961, the Freedom Riders began their operation. And there they traveled. These were civil rights activists, Black and white, from the North, who traveled into the South to test to see that segregated bus terminals were not being allowed because they had been declared unconstitutional. And on May 14th, one of the Freedom Riders buses arrived in Anniston, Alabama. While the police had been notified that the Freedom Riders were coming, they arrived at the bus station shortly after 1 o'clock to find the building was locked. Local Ku Klux Klan leader William Chappell led a mob of 50 armed men with pipes, chains, and bats. And they smashed windows and slashed tires and dented the sides of the riders' bus. Police had been warned that a mob had gathered, but they did not arrive until after the assault had begun. And once it subsided, the police pretended to escort the crippled bus to safety, but instead they abandoned it at the Anniston city limits, and another armed white mob surrounded the bus and began breaking windows. The Freedom Riders refused to exit, but they received no aid from 2 watching highway patrolmen. When a member of the mob tossed a firebomb through a broken bus window, others in the mob attempted to trap the passengers inside the burning vehicle by barricading the door. They only fled when the fuel tank began to explode. The riders were able to escape, only to be attacked and beaten by the mob outside. After police finally dispersed their attackers, they received some limited medical care and were evacuated from Anniston in a convoy organized by Birmingham civil rights leader Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. But this kind of violence for wanting to desegregate bus terminals A little-known event was the Birmingham Children's Crusade on May 2nd of 1963, when more than 1,000 Black children peacefully protested racial segregation in Birmingham. They had been trained in nonviolent resistance, and when they walked out, they did not respond in any way to the police that had gathered as they marched to the 16th Street Baptist Church in downtown Birmingham. Hundreds of these children were assaulted, arrested, and transported to jail. But the children, refused to relent their protests. The next day, when more children began to march, Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor, directed local police and firemen to attack the children with high-pressure fire hoses, batons, and police dogs. The images caused the U.S. Department of Justice to intervene. The campaign ended on May 10th when city officials agreed to desegregate the city's downtown stores and release jailed demonstrators. But the following evening, disgruntled proponents of segregation responded with a series of local bombings. In the wake of this crusade, the Birmingham Board of Education announced that all children who participated in the march would be suspended or expelled from school. A federal district court upheld that ruling, but ultimately the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit reversed the decision and ordered the students readmitted to school. Look at these terrifying protesters who needed to be beaten by batons and fire hoses. And 1963 was a pivotal year. It included the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I have a personal story related to the march that I'll tell you if we have an opportunity. It was the site of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. It was also the year when on September 15th, on what was known as Youth Sunday, the children at the 16th Street Baptist Church were gathering in the basement because they were going to lead worship that day. And at 10:22 in the morning, a collection of 19 sticks of dynamite were detonated under the stairway down to the basement. And 4 little girls were killed in the blast. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair, and Addie Mae's sister, Sarah, was blinded in the attack. There were 4 known Klansmen who had perpetrated the bombing. Everyone knew who they were, but no action was taken. Until 14 years later, one of them was tried and found guilty and imprisoned. Then, 24 years after that, 2 more of the perpetrators were tried and found guilty. The 4th had died in 1994 and escaped any form of punishment. So this is the degree of violent opposition to integration, to the rights of Black people, Black children in our society. 1964 was the site of the Philadelphia, Mississippi murders, when 3 civil rights workers were arrested ostensibly for a traffic stop, murdered by the police, and their bodies buried in a shallow grave nearby, where they were dug up. And that became national news that ultimately triggered the eventual passage of the Civil Rights Act by Congress that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in hiring, promotion and firing, public accommodation, and federally funded programs, and strengthened the enforcement of voting rights and the desegregation of schools. The following year was the Selma to Montgomery March that brought such attention to voting rights and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And we will learn more about that in our next class. It's interesting that the Civil Rights Act was only passed after a 75-day filibuster to avoid its passage, but ultimately it did pass. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned those literacy tests that were created in 1890, ensured that there was federal oversight of specific jurisdictions that had demonstrated intense opposition to African American voting rights, and investigated the use of poll taxes, which should have been illegal and unconstitutional because of a constitutional amendment, but were still taking place. And so the Voting Rights Act took action to try to bring equity and fairness to the enfranchisement of Black citizens. And of course, in 1968, in some respects, we think of this period of coming to an end with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, a tumultuous time in our history, to be sure. But the advances made during the civil rights movement were the result of courageous activists willing to speak out, willing to take action, willing to do what was necessary to help move us toward a more perfect union, a second ray of hope, if you will, that we have inherited.